Well, good morning, and welcome to our Patreon call. It's the question and answer for June. We did skip May, and before we get off, I will try to set a date or at least a time frame for July's Q&A call. And today we're going to talk a little bit about astrology, what it is, what it isn't, some of the basics, just the why you might be interested, and also kind of my approach to it, which is maybe different than what you expect and different than what you've heard of, and perhaps different from what you've had experience with. So I will be right back with the beginning of the questions and answers. Okay, so what I have in front of us now is just it's sort of an empty astrology chart, and we're just going to talk a little bit. It helps me to have a visual. We're just going to talk a little bit about kind of the components of the chart so that we get an idea of what this is all about. But first, let me give you a little intro. So the basic idea behind astrology is a philosophy that's articulated in almost all the traditional wisdom that I know, all the traditions, the healing arts, any cosmology, they all have the similar kind of underpinning. And that is a famous quote from a gentleman by the name of Hermes back in ancient Greek times. And the quote is, "As above, so below, as without, so within, as the universe, so the soul." And there's a similar philosophy reflected in Ayurveda, which I also have talked about, which is the sister science to yoga. And what it basically says is the human being is a microcosm of the macrocosm. So everything that occurs within us on a soul level, a mental level, a heart level, emotional level, and a physical level also occurs in our natural world. And if you study the 4 elements in traditional European culture, or the 5 elements in Ayurvedic and Chinese culture, what you see is that the 5 elements that make up the human being, again on all levels, also make up the world. So it for our Western minds, sometimes it's a little bit of a challenge because we think of ourselves as different and separate, and we don't see the continuity, for instance, between the water in our bodies and the water in the river and the water in the ocean. And therefore, we don't necessarily grasp immediately the fact that because the moon pulls the tides and affects the water on the planet, of course it affects us and our bodies, and emotions are watery substances, so it affects emotions. And I'm not going to spend time on this call, or probably any call, trying to prove the validity of astrology, but I'll just tell you briefly that if you want to know whether the moon has an effect on people, if you can't feel it in yourself, and you probably can if you tune into it, but otherwise you can go ask any police station, mental ward, hospital, any institution that has a lot of people, or even in my own experience, a wood products manufacturing facility that has several hundred people working in it. Everybody will tell you that the moon has an effect on people. So to me, it's not a great leap then to go to all planets have connections to us and have effects. So that, I'll come back to that in a moment, but that's the basic underpinning of astrology, is that what happens out there is reflected in here and vice versa. And what astrology, well, actually, let me continue on that path for a moment. So when I say I'm not going to try to prove the effects of astrology and prove whether it's valid or not, I will tell you that I don't know how it works. I don't know if a planet actually has a physical effect on ourselves, on our lives. I mean, certainly the moon would, and the connection and the effect on the tides would have me believe that yes, the planets have actual physical effects through methods that we just simply don't understand yet. There are things we can't measure, and we don't know how to measure, and we don't even know how to ask the right questions in some cases. So that's a possibility. I honestly don't think that's an important part of the conversation for whether we want to use and become familiar with astrology. I think the thing that's important is to know that there is a correlation between the movements of the planets and the events of our lives and within our bodies and psyches. And whether we know how that happens, the mechanism is not the cause, right? We don't need to know the mechanism to know that it happens. And the final thing to say about that is trust your own experience. That's why I do astrology, is because my experience has shown that when Saturn is doing certain things in the sky, certain things happen and don't happen in my life. I feel certain transits as they come, and if I'm not paying attention in the mornings to my chart and something comes up, I will often go get my chart out and start taking a look at what is going on, what am I feeling. And what I find is that astrology gives me structure and name and a little bit of, sometimes it saves my sanity when I don't understand why something is going on. And the other thing is it gives a sense of timing. And we'll talk about that a little bit when we get more into the chart, but astrology gives us context. It gives us sometimes an intellectual understanding, sometimes an intuitive understanding, perhaps of what purpose might be served for some sensation we have, some feeling, some event in our lives that we don't necessarily like, or maybe we do like it. But astrology can give us some context and background and depth and perspective. And then it can also give us a sense of, is this something that's going to last the rest of my life? Is this an occurrence that's going to be quick and done in a week? Or it gives us a sense of what might be coming, and also allows us to look back and make sense of things in the past. So to me, that's a lot of the reason for doing and paying attention to astrology. So a couple of common questions. One is, and this is, one of the most common questions that I hear today is, okay, why do people tell me that my sun sign is, let's say, Taurus, if I'm born in May, when the actual zodiac sign overhead, the constellation rather that's overhead, is not Taurus, but Aries. And I've heard people say astrology doesn't work because it doesn't even know what constellation is really up there in the sky. So what we're talking about, what this really means and what this is really about, is there are two different systems of astrology. Well, there's probably a lot more, but there are two basic systems. And what I practice is termed tropical astrology. And what that means is it's tied to the seasons, meaning it's tied to the sun and the movements of the sun. And if you're of Northern European descent especially, or somewhere further away from the equator, tropical astrology is likely to be what your ancestors used and what your ancestors helped to develop that's not entirely true, but that's just my experience of it. And the way it works is that the signs, rather than the constellations, rather than the actual stars in the sky, at one point they matched up. At one point, the seasons and the constellations matched up to, I think, I want to say 2,000 or 3,000 years ago. The way things got started, at least that we're using today, is that people observed the sky. They noticed that when the sun rose in the constellation of Aries, certain things were going on on the ground in terms of seasonal effects, what was going on with the seasons and the weather and the climate. And they noticed that people had certain characteristics when they were born in that time. So that was where sun and springtime and Aries got linked originally. And so 0 degrees Aries pointed to the day of the spring equinox, when day and night were of equal length. The sun rose at 0 degrees of the constellation Aries. I can get into a little bit more of the detail about the constellations and the wheel of the zodiac, but that's what triggers the beginning of the whole zodiac wheel, is that sun rising at 0 degrees Aries. Now, through the eons, through the millennia since that time, because of the way the Earth wobbles on its axis, the constellations are no longer in exactly the same place in the sky at exactly the same time during the year. So today, when the sun rises on the first day of spring, when the day and night are equal in the northern hemisphere, right? That's the spring equinox. That hasn't changed because that's relative to the Earth. When we look up at where the sun, what constellation is in the sky when the sun rises, it's no longer Aries, it's Pisces. So tropical astrology is artificially, if you will, ties the first day of spring to the sign of Aries, regardless of where the constellation is in the sky. And so what we talk about when we talk about somebody being a Taurus or an Aquarius or whatever, is that their sun, the day they were born, their sun was in the tropical sign, the place in the sky that's marked by that zodiac sign based on the seasons. So for instance, if you're a Capricorn like me, what that means is that your sun, when you were born, the sun was in the sign of Capricorn according to tropical astrology, meaning that you were born sometime near the winter solstice, because the day of the solstice, the day of the winter solstice, marks the first, the 0 degree point of the sign of Capricorn. So hopefully that's as clear as I can make it. That makes some sense in terms of what tropical astrology is really based on. It's really based on the seasons. So it doesn't make it incorrect, it makes it different. There is another form of astrology that's named sidereal, meaning with the stars. And you can find a sidereal astrologer, or the Vedic astrology out of India is also based on the sidereal system, where when you get your chart read, it will look at the actual constellation in the sky now where your sun, moon, and planets are. So you could get a chart reading in tropical and a chart reading in sidereal and actually have your planets in different signs. And what I spent because this is what I do, and I think this is what a lot of us do, I tried to integrate the two systems when I first started learning astrology. And my mentor, Emily Trinkus, gave me probably the best advice I can give anybody about this subject, is that there are two different systems. There are many different systems. We can talk about that a little bit too. There are many different systems. They all work. You get what you get out of each of them. They don't have to integrate. They don't have to overlap. You choose what you're most comfortable with, what appeals to you most. If you have any ties to Northern European traditions, some of the Druid stuff, the pagans, the Norse. If you have any ties to any of those kinds of traditions, then you'll probably want to choose tropical astrology, because again, what you're really paying attention to is the position of the sun in the sky and the signs associated with each of the 30-degree segments of the sky. And then but again, there's different forms, and try them all. Try them all and see what you like if you're so inclined. I find it a little bit overwhelming to try them all, but maybe, you never know. Maybe over the years I'll get to more of the systems. At the moment, there's so much to study in the system that I use that it feels like a lifetime of work and fun and play. All right, so that's the explanation of the why are the constellations in different places. It's called precession, the precession of the equinox, if you're interested in the technical terms and you want to look it up. So let's just talk just very briefly about the structure of the chart and the kind of components of it, and that will help a little bit. So I have on the screen just a blank chart. None of the planets are on it, but if you look on the outside of the circle, you can see, perhaps not, it's not lovely because of the colors, but you can see, well, it is lovely. It's harder to see because of the colors. You can see the various signs. So that on the outside of the wheel, you can see the signs of the zodiac, beginning with this red one on the left, just where the AS marks the beginning of it. And it's the ram's horns for Aries. So the way the chart is set up, this line on the left side, across the left side of the chart where my cursor is moving over, is the horizon. Actually, this whole line that goes across the chart is the horizon. The side on the left is the east. And you can think about it as opposite of a map, because rather than looking down at the planet where east rises, or the sun rises on the right and sets on the left, it's the opposite. We're looking up at the sky with our feet pointed sort of to the south and head sort of towards the north. Well, we're at least facing south. So the sun is rising on our left. And that 0 degrees of Aries in a natural chart won't show that way necessarily in your chart unless you were born on the spring equinox. This is how the chart would show up naturally. This is the depiction of all the zodiac signs. Here's Aries. The second sign is Taurus, and then we get Gemini and Cancer, Leo, Virgo, Libra, the scales, Scorpio, the scorpion. You can see the little scorpion tail. Sagittarius with the arrow of the archer. Capricorn, which is a very odd looking glyph, but it's meant to depict the goat or the sea goat, because Capricorn is actually a combination fish and goat. Aquarius looks like waves, but it's actually 2 snakes, signifies wisdom. Aquarius, the water bearer. And then the last sign of the zodiac, Pisces, the 2 fish swimming in opposite directions. But this is the zodiac. The signs The zodiac symbolizes that wheel. It's a sort of a strip of width in which the sun travels around the earth, and it's about 27 degrees of declination on either side of the sun. So it's a band of not quite 60 degrees wide, and it's the circle which, from our perspective on Earth, that the sun travels as it travels around the sky. Again, we know that the sun isn't going around us, we're going around the sun. But from our perspective, as human beings on the planet, looking up at the sky, it looks like the sun makes a circle around us. And it does so in a specific path, and that path is the path of the zodiac. And then the path of the zodiac is divided up into 30-degree bits. It's a 360 degrees, right, of the circle. And then 12 signs, 30 degrees apiece. And then where the sun rises is what tells us, where the sun is at the time of our birth is what tells us our sun sign. So again, that's what the zodiac is. From a tropical astrology perspective, no longer connected to the constellations, but connected to where the sun rises at a given point in the year. And if you've read a little bit about some of the stones and the markers that have been put up throughout the ages, such as Stonehenge, you know that the ancients were quite good at pinpointing exactly where the sun would rise on a particular day of the year, for instance. All right, so that leads me to a kind of a short subject, and that is another, it's not really a question, it's more of a comment that I get from people, and that is, let's say, we'll use me as an example. People would say, I'm a Capricorn. And then when we actually look at a chart, and we're going to just look at the chart of the Capricorn full moon. I'm guessing that did not work, so I'm going to pause the share and share again. Okay, so now we're looking at the chart of the full moon that's coming up right now, Capricorn full moon. What I wanted to say, and you can pretend it's a person because somebody obviously is going to be born on the Capricorn full moon. So what happens is people say to themselves or say to others that I'm a Capricorn. What they mean by that is that the one thing that I can know about myself, astrologically speaking, just from my birthday, and this isn't 100% accurate because the dates can be a little shifty towards the beginning and end, is that my sun is in a particular sign. So when somebody says I am a, or he is a, whatever, Taurus, Aries, Pisces, Libra, what they mean is that person's sun is in that sign. So for instance, if somebody were born today on the Capricorn full moon, they would actually be a Cancer. So they would have their sun in the sign of Cancer just because the sun is opposite from the moon on the full moon, and the sun is in the sign of Cancer. And just as another example of tropical astrology, in tropical astrology, the sign of Cancer is what begins. So 0 degrees Cancer is what happens on the day of the summer solstice. So we've gone from 0 degrees Aries on the first day of spring at the spring equinox, and now we're a quarter of the way through the year. The sun sun comes up in the sign of Cancer on the first day of summer, the solstice. 0 degrees Cancer marks the summer solstice. So back to the person, back to the chart and the person. So the person born after the sun, just after the summer solstice, on June 21st-ish, and again, it can be a little bit different from year to year, is going to say, I'm a Cancer. But what they really mean is, I was born when the sun was in the sign of Cancer. So when you look at this chart, and again, this could be a person's chart, it just happens to be the chart of the full moon. But when you look at this chart, what you see is the sun is just one point. So the sun's the most important point in many ways. The sun is what gives us our vitality. It gives us our sense of identity. The sun is what feeds us at a very deep energetic level, not so much an emotional level. That's where the moon comes in. But the sun, as important as it is still only a piece of the picture. And for instance, when we look here at this chart, we see that the sun is in the sign of Cancer. We also see that this is I'm not going to go into complicated. If this were a person's chart, the sun would be at the very bottom of their chart, and the bottom of the chart is the furthest below the horizon when we were born. Remember, this is the horizon line. And so from just a pure metaphorical standpoint, the sun would be at the most it's at the innermost part of the self. It points to what's inside. So for instance, maybe you'd say introversion, but more like this person's sun, because it's at the bottom of the chart, is very much what they identify with on a very emotional level, on a very basic and emotional level. So there's a lot more to it. So then we would see that the moon, which is probably one of the other most important points of the chart, is up here in Capricorn, which is directly opposite from Cancer. That's why we have a Capricorn full moon when the sun is in Cancer. Moon and sun opposite each other. And then we would draw conclusions, maybe not draw conclusions, then we would test hypotheses about this person on an emotional feeling level based on their moon being in Capricorn. And then we would look and say, oh, wow, the moon, one of the most important points, is right next to this other point, this other planet. This happens to be Saturn with the cross of matter above the little crescent moon. And then we would take off from there. And then we would do that with every single point. And then we would also look at how they're related to each other. The red lines show things that are in a dynamic tension with each other, meaning opportunities for growth or challenges, or places where there's potential alchemy, or the blue lines where there's harmony and flowing aspects and things working, aspects of the person and the individual and the personality working together, flowing together and harmonizing with each other. So the sun sign, all that to illustrate that the sun sign is really a fairly small piece of the whole person. So if you really want to understand what's going on, yes, you can read the daily horoscopes in the paper, or you can find a better quality one that says if you're a Capricorn sun, if you're a Capricorn, quote unquote, or if you're a Cancer, well, here's what's happening to you today. And what's going on is that the astrologer is looking at transits. In other words, what's traveling or what the planets are doing in the sky right now, and drawing some conclusions just based on how they're impacting the sun. So you may not have the experience that's being told to you in a horoscope, because you're only seeing, you're only being told about the effects on your sun. So you may feel part of it, But there may be something else so dramatic going on in the chart. For instance, it may be a full moon. Maybe it's a full moon, so the moon is directly opposite your, or maybe it's not. Well, in other words, maybe there's something directly opposite your sun in your chart that's not directly opposite the sun in the sky. Anyway, hopefully that was, hopefully that's somewhat clear. We could look at, well, I don't think we will. I don't think we'll look at an example, but hopefully that gives you some sense of the fact that you're not just your sun sign. There's a lot more complexity. And even though what's happening to your sun on any given day based on just general world astrology, it may have some effect, and you may notice those horoscopes being accurate. But if it seems overshadowed by something that's much more in your face and much more alive for you at the moment, that's why, because there's so much more happening, and you are just, you carry all of those energies inside you. You carry all of the rhythms inside of you. And so the rhythm with just one piece might be overshadowed by other rhythms. And so, so that leads me to another sort of general discussion about what astrology is and why I think it's valuable. And it kind of goes back to what we said at the beginning, microcosm. I, as a person, am a microcosm of the macrocosm world. And one of the things that, again, that we learn through wisdom traditions and the ancient traditions that were connected to the natural world is that the natural world moves in cycles, right? And we see that, we know it, because it's really obvious just through the course of a day. Sun comes up, it goes to a high point in the sky, and then it goes down. Maybe the moon comes up. Moon is a little bit less predictable because it moves around more, has different patterns of movement, whereas the sun is moving in a very predictable pattern through the year, through the day, through the year, through the seasons. So that's one example of a rhythm. And our bodies, whether we know it intellectually or emotionally or not, our bodies know those rhythms. Our body knows that when the sun comes up, our energy comes up. It's time to get up and do things. And my aside about those of you that believe you're night people, maybe you are. The only way to really know is to go without electricity or any kind of artificial light for a week or two, and then decide if you're a night person. If you still want to be up at night wandering around in the dark, and I do mean in the dark, like in the woods somewhere, then maybe you're a night person, and I will leave that alone. I won't go any further with that. But if you turn off the lights for a couple weeks and deal with the darkness, then let me know if you're really a night person or not. So all that to say that our bodies know what's natural, because our bodies are still connected to nature, because they're part of nature. Our body is made of the earth. It's made of all the substances found on the earth. It's made of what we feed it on many levels. And so it's still tied into the rhythm. So one of the obvious rhythms is the sun. Another obvious rhythm, because it's so visible, is the moon. Now, if we start paying attention to the night sky, as the ancients did, we can start to see rhythms of other planets, such as Venus. Right now, the Capricorn full moon 2018, Venus is what's known as an evening star. She's actually a planet. Planet just means wanderer. Planet means that which moves, as opposed to what we'd call the fixed stars, which don't move except through the seasons, right? Yeah, they're always in the same place in the sky, whereas the planets move around. But if we were out watching the sky every evening right now, we would see Venus in this cycle of rising higher and higher in the evening sky. And then in 3 or 4 months, we would start to see her set. Then we'd see her disappear. Meaning, and when I say set, I mean over the course of many nights, she would become lower in the sky, closer to the horizon, and then she would be invisible because she would be so close to the sun. She'd be traveling with the sun. And then if we still kept watching over the time that she's invisible and we kept watching for her, then we'd see that, oh, she's rising in the east. We would see her reborn, so to speak, as what's called the morning star. So again, all of the planets have rhythms and cycles, and there is a part of us that is mirrored by, or mirrors, depending on how you want to look at it, those other rhythms. So Venus has a 19-month pattern of beginning to end. When she's born as the morning star, goes back down into below the horizon, or below visibility, hanging out with the sun, essentially comes back up as an evening star, then goes back down invisible again because she's in the path of the sun, we can't see her, and then reborn again as the morning star. That's a 19-month cycle. It's called a synodic cycle because it's relative to the sun. But all the planets, all the planetary bodies have their own cycles. An example is Saturn. Saturn is the furthest, most visible planet in the solar system, visible to the naked eye. We can see, obviously, some of the others with telescopes. Saturn's the furthest, most visible planet, and it has a 29-year cycle. I mean, it orbits over the course of 29 years, or 29 and a half, something in that vicinity. And so we have rhythms in our lives of 29 years. And that, for example, those are called, the point at about 29 or 29 and a half years of age is called the first Saturn return. It's when Saturn, the planet that's still in motion, the planet in the sky, returns to the same spot as it was when we were born. That only happens every 29 and a half years. Well, if you look at the patterns of people's lives, you see that there are cycles that complete at every 29 and a half years. At age 29, many people find that they have a feeling of pressure. They're about to turn 30, so everybody assumes it's, oh my gosh, I'm about to turn 30. There's something about that magic number 30 that gets me. It has to do with the Saturn cycle. And then the second Saturn cycle comes at about age 58. And there's a whole body of wisdom around what that one signifies. Another planet that has cycles that we're very tuned into as a culture, even though we don't know they're related to the planet, is the planet Uranus. So the planet Uranus has an 84-year cycle, meaning it goes around the sun every 84 years. But when it's halfway around, so if we're born with the planet Uranus here, it goes halfway around in 42 years to here. And that's the time of our life where we have give or take a couple of years. This one's actually not that exact, and you will feel the effects before and after. We have what's known as midlife crisis. And again, you can see with real examples of real people, maybe in your own life, depending on how old you are and what's happened and what you've noticed happening, is that 40 or that 84-year cycle, the halfway point of it at age 42, seems to trigger some kind of unrest. Uranus in astrology is known as the Great Awakener. It's the revolutionary, the rebel, the one It's the force within us that's mirrored and exemplified by the planet outside us that says, I want to be my own person. I want to be me to the maximum extent of being me. I want to find out who I am. I want freedom, personal freedom, to be myself. And that often shows up as what we've labeled midlife crisis. But again, it's mirrored in that movement of Uranus, the planet, in our charts and around our charts, and its relationship to where it was when we were born. So there's obviously, well, astrology is so rich. There are 10 planets we call the sun and the moon planet. There are asteroids, major and minor. Some astrologers do look at positions of the fixed stars as well. And at any rate, all of these bodies have rhythms, and at least all of the planetary bodies and the asteroids have rhythms and movement. And what we are doing with astrology is seeing the patterns reflected in human behavior, world events, that are as they correlate to these planetary movements. It's nothing more complicated than seeing patterns over time and making those correlations. That's what astrology is. So that brings me to another subject, and that's the subject. For me, it's the difference between modern and ancient astrology and how astrology has sort of morphed over the eons. And that comes to, I think, it's both a question and a fear that I get from people who come for readings or who I have conversations with about astrology. And it comes down to prediction. So there's there's sort of a fascination with astrology, and I would say a falsity of astrology as being a fortune-telling kind of activity. And certainly there are people that use it as such, and even some of those daily horoscopes that we talked about earlier, that based on your sun sign are, you're going to meet a tall, handsome stranger, or you're going to come into a lot of money, or you're going to have some crisis, or somebody near you is going to die, or all of those kinds of things are what astrology seems to have a very strong reputation for. And it's partly because of the way it has been used in the past. And it's also partly because that's it's just like the simple way, and it's the caricature of astrology today. It's a simple way to think about it, oversimplified and, in my mind, incorrect, and certainly by the way I practice. And it's sort of the caricature of astrology. So there is certainly a predictive element of astrology. And again, it's based on patterns, and it's based on patterns over centuries of observation. And it's both about people and personality, and then it's about events. And I would say that what astrology is more useful for today, and what it has evolved into, and in fact, there's a branch of astrology called evolutionary astrology. What it has evolved into is more helping us see what's happening at a much deeper level than just mundane physical events in our lives. Not to say that those aren't useful sometimes, but to get really concrete with predictions in today's day and age is likely to be incorrect and unhelpful. I don't necessarily need to know a specific event that might happen to me at some point in the future. What's more useful is what I might need to be thinking about in terms of my own growth and development based on what's coming down the pike. not in terms of a car wreck, for instance, but in terms of a midlife crisis, for instance. If I know that at this particular age, I'm going to start having these feelings of unrest, and that the idea behind them, that the sort of the higher purpose for these feelings of unrest is for me to look around, see what I've made of my life, and decide, is this really what I want? Is this really what's for my highest good? Is this really what is most authentic for me? That's a higher evolutionary purpose for astrology than you're going to have, which is what happened to me, you're going to have a car wreck at age 42 or 43 or whatever it was, and it's going to shake up your life. So I want to say a little bit more about that in the last few minutes, and maybe tell a couple of stories. So if you think about our lives, at least in the Western world, I live in the US, so at least in a place like the US, despite our limitations, as we all have limitations, we have more freedom to do what we want, to be what we want in this life right now, in this place, than perhaps at any point in history that I know of. And maybe others can say that's not entirely true, but for instance, I can be born into a family of carpenters, and I don't have to be a carpenter. Whereas there are still places in the world, and there certainly are in our history, when you were born into a certain kind of family, it set the pattern for your life. Well, if you think about astrology back in those days, where women had fewer freedoms, for instance, where they couldn't have their own work, they couldn't have their own money, they couldn't have their own land, and they their fate and their destiny was determined by who they were able to attract to marry them, which explains a lot of things about some of the shadowy feminine tendencies that are leftovers from those days when it was sheer survival. That's another aside. That's a sidetrack. But if you think about astrology in the context of the time, when, where, and how, and to whom you were born determined so much of your life, you can see how astrology could have been much more predictive. And my favorite story comes out, I learned it from a book by Liz Green called, I want to say it's called The Astrology of Fate. And she relates a story from it's essentially the Middle Ages, at least by my recollection, the Middle Ages, of a king. Kings had astrologers, right? Astrologers were members of the staff. And this king had an astrologer who told him, you're going to die on this date, and this is exactly how you're going to die. You're going to die in battle, and you're going to die of a wound to the head, and it's going to be a slow and painful death. So this king got a second opinion. Seems reasonable, right? This is a big deal. And I believe it was, it may or may not have been on an eclipse, which solar eclipse is often associated with the death of kings. A lot behind that, a lot of mythology, a lot of metaphor. But at any rate, this is what happened. That king, on the day he was to die, I think actually prepared himself for battle and prepared himself for death. And then he was in, I think it was just a duel with another person, knight, whatever it was, and did indeed sustain not just an injury to the head, but a lance through his shield or through his mask into his eyes. And then it took several days for him to die, but it was on the exact day. It all happened, and it was a wound to the head. And again, because you're talking about somebody who didn't have a choice as to whether to be king, who certainly put a lot of stock in the predictions made for him. But interestingly enough, here, all those factors came together, and there's a whole lot in the chart, obviously, that showed these astrologers had to do with, I don't even remember, and I couldn't reconstruct it all right now for you. But the point is that there was a time in our history when it was easier to make concrete predictions because our lives had more concrete restrictions on them. Today, we have much more freedom of choice on the physical plane in terms of what we do, where we live. We can move from point A to point B. That changes what the patterns of the sky look like based on our location. We can marry and divorce. We don't have to be bound even by gender roles, which again is something that's unique and different today than it would have been in that time period where, for the most part, people were bound by gender roles. If you were born a woman, you dressed like, behaved, acted like, and had the limitations of a woman, and vice versa if you were born as a man. So all that to sort of, I'm trying to dispel some common, I don't like to say myths because myths are actually based on reality. Real mythology is, again, stories based on patterns of human behavior and world activity. And that's why mythology is such an important part of astrology, because it puts stories to the archetypes and the patterns of the planets. But anyway, what I'm trying to do is dispel some of the falsehoods and perhaps the old beliefs and old stories about astrology, to give you at least just a little more breathing space about, is this something that's useful? Are you interested in it? Can it be helpful for your life? I will tell you that I don't think I've done a reading yet where somebody didn't walk away feeling an affirmation of something that they knew was true for them, but they wanted to get just a little bit of an outside confirmation of it, or they walked away with a little bit of relief about, now I understand what's going on with my life and I have more information and more ability to work with it in a constructive way. They may have learned about a skill or a talent that they had that as soon as they heard this might be something that you should explore, they had an aha moment of, yes, that's exactly what I've been trying to put my finger on but couldn't until there were different words were put around it. Astrology is a language, and I consider it the language of the soul speaking to us. And so when we get a reading, we're basically getting an interpretation. It's more of an interpreter putting words to our soul's voice for us to understand a little bit more about our lives, a little bit more about where we're going. So I hope this has been helpful. There are articles on Patreon. Many of them are free. I think are available to publicly. This particular recording is going to be public. I do readings, obviously. You can schedule those on my website, KristineBackus.com. And I also have blog articles. I've been writing new moon posts for almost a year now. And there are other astrology posts. And of course, there's a huge amount of resources on the web. So if you get curious, take one of those avenues. I will also mention before I close that I have put together a basic beginning astrology class. It's online. Again, it's on my website. It's under the astrology tab. It's called Learning to Read the Map of Your Soul, Astrology 101. And it's just it's a 6 week, if you choose to go once a week, it's a recorded sessions teaching the language of astrology and teaching it in a way that helps you to actually feel it so that you can use your own intuition and learn enough of the language and enough of the symbols on the chart so that you can look up and start to take control of that and understand and read your own chart. So thank you again for joining me. And if you have comments or questions, there's a place for comments and questions below the link to the recording when I post it. And please feel free to write in, and I will answer as many questions as I can here on Patreon. And thank you for being here.